In the opening year of the Pacific War, the skies belonged to Japan. From the moment the first Zero fighters appeared over Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and the Philippines, Allied pilots learned to fear their speed, agility, and the skill of the men who flew them. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was light, fast, and deadly. It could outturn nearly anything in the sky, climb with breathtaking speed, and range farther than any American or British fighter could hope to match. For Japanese commanders and aviators, the early victories confirmed what they had long believed, that their pilots were the best in the world, their machines unmatched, and their empire protected by warriors who carried both skill and spirit into the clouds. Over the jungles of Burma, the waters of the Coral Sea, and the island chains of the Philippines, Zeros carved their legend. Dozens of Allied aircraft fell in flames for every Japanese fighter lost. American pilots in their P-40 Warhawks and F-4F Wildcats reported duels that ended almost before they began. The Zero could turn inside them, climb above them, dive away from them. It seemed invincible. This aura of invincibility seeped into the mindset of Japanese aviators. They believed, with reason, that their planes and their training gave them absolute dominance. To fly a Zero in 1942 was to feel like a master of the Pacific. Young men, barely out of flight school, spoke with the confidence of aces. Veterans, many hardened over China, carried themselves like samurai reborn in cockpits. For them, the Pacific sky was a hunting ground, and they were the hunters. But that confidence contained a blind spot. Japan had invested heavily in pilot training before the war, producing some of the most skilled flyers anywhere. Yet the system was slow and rigid. Losses would prove impossible to replace, and in the factories of America, far across the ocean, a new machine was already rolling off the assembly lines, a machine that looked unlike anything the Japanese had ever seen, and which would change the balance of the air war forever. The first rumors sounded improbable. Intelligence reports hinted at a twin-engined American fighter, fast as a single-engine plane, climbing higher than a Zero, with a range long enough to fly across oceans. Japanese officers dismissed it as exaggeration. How could a twin-engine fighter outmaneuver a Zero? Heavy aircraft could never match the elegance of their agile, lightweight machines. Such a design would be clumsy, they thought, vulnerable to the knife-edge turns of Japanese tactics. They were wrong. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike any fighter the world had seen. Twin booms stretched out behind the cockpit pod, joined at the tail by a horizontal stabilizer, giving it a silhouette so strange that pilots who first encountered it often thought they faced bombers or experimental aircraft. Its turbo-supercharged Allison engines gave it power at altitudes no Zero could reach. Its heavy armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon clustered in the nose, allowed it to strike with deadly accuracy, without the convergence problems that plagued wing-mounted guns, and its range meant it could patrol across the vast distances of the Pacific, where so many battles would be decided. For the Japanese pilots who still ruled the skies in early 1942, the Lightning's arrival would be nothing short of a revelation. They believed themselves masters, secure in their skills, their tactics, and their machines. They would soon learn that the war in the air was changing, and that their dominance would not last forever. In the early months, thousands of Japanese pilots fought with pride, never imagining that their enemies could produce a weapon that would rival the Zero. Yet by 1943, the P-38 would prove them wrong. Over the jungles of New Guinea, the waters of the Solomon Islands, and the skies above Rabaul, they would look up and see the silver glint of twin tails against the sun. And in that moment, more than 1,000 Japanese aviators would feel the same shock. The sky they thought was theirs now belonged to someone else. The age of the Zero was ending. The age of the Lightning was about to begin. The arrival of the P-38 Lightning in the Pacific Theater was not just the debut of a new aircraft. It was the introduction of an entirely new philosophy of air combat, one that the Japanese were wholly unprepared to face. To the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, who had spent years perfecting the art of dogfighting in lightweight, highly maneuverable aircraft, the Lightning was a contradiction made flesh. A heavy, twin-engine fighter that should not have been able to dominate the skies, and yet from the first moment its twin tails gleamed in Pacific sunlight, the P-38 shocked them. The Lightning had been born out of a radical idea. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps had demanded a fighter that could reach 360 miles per hour, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and still carry heavy armament. Most companies scoffed at the requirements, but Lockheed, under the design genius of Clarence Kelly Johnson, proposed something entirely different. A twin-engined, twin-boom aircraft that looked like no fighter before it. Engineers nicknamed it the Fork-Tailed Devil. To pilots, it was simply the Lightning. By 1942, Lightnings were reaching operational units. They were faster than any U.S. fighter then in service, with top speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. Turbo superchargers let them breathe at altitudes where Japanese planes gasped for air. Twin engines gave them range unmatched by any single-engine fighter, a vital asset in the Pacific where distances between islands stretched for hundreds of miles. And their concentrated nose armament, 4 50-caliber machine guns plus a 20-millimeter cannon, meant that a single burst could tear apart even the most agile opponent. The Japanese first encountered the P-38 over the Aleutians and then in the South Pacific. At first, reports were confused. Pilots described American planes with 2 tails that seemed impossible to catch. Some believed they were experimental bombers. But when Lightnings began to cut through bomber formations and scatter fighter escorts, Japanese commanders realized they faced something entirely new. One of the Lightning's greatest strengths was its ability to choose the fight. Unlike the Zero, which relied on tight turns and maneuver battles, the P-38 exploited speed and altitude. It could dive faster than a Zero could hope to follow, climb back to altitude, and slash again. Japanese pilots tried to force the Americans into turning duels, but the Lightnings refused. Instead, they fought by a new rule book: boom and zoom. Hit hard, then escape before the enemy could react. This was disorienting for Japanese aviators. For years, they had been told that the Zero's turning ability was unbeatable, that any enemy drawn into a dogfight would lose. Now they faced opponents who refused to play the game. Instead of circling, the P-38s attacked in fast passes, breaking up formations, shooting down stragglers, and vanishing before the Zeros could respond. It was like fighting ghosts, one Japanese pilot recalled. They appeared from above, struck with terrible firepower, and disappeared again. The shock extended beyond tactics. Japanese pilots who managed to hit a P-38 were horrified to see it keep flying. The Zero, light and fragile, could be brought down by a handful of bullets. The Lightning, with its armored cockpit and twin engines, often absorbed punishment and survived. Many Lightnings returned to base, trailing smoke from one engine, still carrying their pilots home. To the Japanese, this resilience felt unfair, as if the Americans had built machines that defied the natural order of combat. Word of the new fighter spread quickly through Japanese squadrons. Some gave it nicknames: Two-Headed Dragon, Fork-Tailed Demon. Rumors circulated that it was invincible. Young pilots, fresh from training, whispered about the American plane that could not be outclimbed or outrun. Veterans, more experienced, cautioned that the Lightning could be beaten if caught low and slow, but they admitted privately that such chances were rare. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time, Japanese pilots entered combat uncertain of their superiority. Where once they had approached duels with confidence, now they scanned the skies nervously for the glint of twin tails. One officer admitted after the war, "The first time I saw the Lightning, I felt the war had changed. We no longer hunted freely. We were being hunted." The Americans, too, recognized the effect. Pilots flying the P-38 loved their machines. They knew they could outrange and outclimb their opponents. They developed tactics that exploited every advantage, turning the Lightning into a predator of the skies. Famous aces like Richard Bong, Thomas Maguire, and Charles MacDonald made their reputations in the Lightning, tallying dozens of kills each, many against stunned Japanese opponents who never understood how the tide had turned. By the end of 1942, the P-38 was no longer just a rumor or an isolated presence. It was becoming a mainstay of American air power in the Pacific. Squadrons of Lightnings escorted bombers, swept enemy skies, and patrolled vast distances where Zeros could not follow. To Japanese commanders, the Lightning was more than a nuisance. It was a harbinger. The Empire's grip on the air was slipping. The age of Japanese dominance was ending. The age of the Lightning had arrived, and more than 1,000 Japanese pilots would soon feel its sting. The Solomon Islands were a proving ground for air combat, a vast expanse of ocean dotted with jungle-covered ridges, where control of the skies meant control of supply lines and survival on the ground. When American Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, they set off a campaign that would become one of the bloodiest in the Pacific. For months, Japanese and American forces clashed in desperate battles on land, sea, and air. The skies above Henderson Field became a daily arena of life and death, and it was here that the Japanese pilots first felt the full shock of the P-38 Lightning. Until then, Japanese aviators had fought primarily against F-4F Wildcats and P-40 Warhawks, machines that, while brave, were no match for the nimble Zero. The Japanese were accustomed to dogfights where their agility gave them the edge, where their training in tight turns and climbing spirals delivered victory. But in late 1942, as American reinforcements poured into the Solomons, new aircraft began to arrive. Among them were the P-38 Lightnings, their twin tails gleaming in the tropical sun, their engines thundering as they climbed to altitudes the Zeros could barely reach. The first encounters were bewildering for Japanese pilots. They expected to force the Americans into the familiar dance of turns and loops. Instead, the P-38s refused to play. They soared high, then dove with astonishing speed, unleashing concentrated bursts of fire that ripped through Japanese formations. Before the Zeros could react, the Lightnings climbed away, their twin engines carrying them beyond reach. It was not combat as the Japanese understood it. It was something new, something terrifying. One Japanese veteran later described his first duel with the Lightning. "We tried to circle with them, but they would not circle. They came like falcons, striking once, and then they were gone. We could not catch them. We could not stop them." The impact on morale was immediate. For the first time since the war began, Japanese pilots felt hunted. Lightnings escorted bombers on long-range missions, swatting aside interceptors that tried to break through. They prowled above the jungle canopy, pouncing on stragglers. Their heavy, nose-mounted guns meant that a single burst could shred a Zero's fragile frame. Japanese squadrons that had once flown with confidence now looked over their shoulders constantly, scanning for the glint of twin tails. The statistics told the story. Within weeks, Japanese losses over Guadalcanal began to climb at unsustainable rates. American pilots flying the P-38 quickly racked up victories. The Lightning's ability to stay aloft for hours allowed them to intercept Japanese raids far from Henderson Field, exhausting their enemies before battle even began. Zeros often arrived over target areas low on fuel, while the P-38 still had plenty of endurance. The tide of air superiority was turning. For the ground troops below, the effect was just as profound. Marines on Guadalcanal, who had endured relentless bombing raids in the campaign's early days, began to notice a change. More and more often, Japanese bombers were intercepted before they could reach the beaches. More and more dogfights ended with enemy planes spiraling into the jungle or sea. The roar of P-38 engines overhead became a symbol of hope, proof that the Americans could seize control of the skies. The Japanese command struggled to adapt. They ordered their pilots to try new tactics, to dive away from the Lightnings instead of attempting turns, to attack in coordinated groups. But shortages of experienced flyers undermined these efforts. Many of Japan's best pilots had already been lost in earlier campaigns. Replacements lacked the training to face an opponent as formidable as the Lightning. Each month, the attrition grew worse. Some Japanese officers admitted privately that Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end of their air supremacy. Reports from returning pilots described encounters with two-tailed demons that seemed immune to their best efforts. A diary entry from one squadron leader summed up the despair. "We are no longer masters of the air. The Americans have found a machine that surpasses us. The Lightning has changed the sky." For the Americans, Guadalcanal was proof of concept. The P-38 was not just another fighter. It was a strategic weapon. Its long range allowed it to escort bombers deep into enemy territory. Its speed and altitude gave it dominance in combat. Its survivability meant that pilots could fight and live to fight again, building experience and confidence. Young American aviators grew into seasoned aces, their names becoming legends across the Pacific. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in early 1943, the Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft and irreplaceable numbers of skilled pilots. The P-38 had played a crucial role in that attrition. For the men who faced it, the memory was seared into their minds. More than 1,000 Japanese pilots across the theater would in time encounter the Lightning. Many would not return. The shock of Guadalcanal echoed far beyond the Solomon Islands. It marked the moment when Japanese pilots realized that the war in the air was no longer theirs to command. The hunter had become the hunted. The twin tails of the Lightning had become the symbol of a new reality. The Americans were not only matching them, they were surpassing them. The Pacific was not like Europe. In Europe, battles could be fought within a day's flight of bases, with airfields scattered across friendly territory. In the Pacific, the distances were vast, stretches of blue water hundreds, sometimes thousands, of miles wide separating islands and battlefronts. For Japanese pilots, who had once celebrated the range of their Zero, these distances had been an advantage early in the war. They could outfly their American counterparts, strike targets far away, and still return to their carriers or island bases. But when the P-38 Lightning entered the theater, the advantage disappeared. The Lightning's long reach was its defining feature. With twin engines and enormous fuel capacity, the P-38 could fly missions lasting 8, 10, sometimes even 12 hours. Auxiliary drop tanks extended that range even further. In the Solomons, in New Guinea, in the Philippines, Lightnings became the eyes, ears, and fists of American air power. They could patrol areas that no other Allied fighter could cover, escort bombers across oceans, and intercept Japanese raids long before they reached their targets. To Japanese commanders, this endurance was stunning. They had expected American fighters to remain tethered to short ranges, vulnerable if drawn into prolonged engagements. Instead, they discovered that lightnings could appear almost anywhere, at any time. Pilots flying what they believed were safe patrols found themselves ambushed by twin-tailed demons that had flown hundreds of miles to find them. Bombers that had once relied on the Zero for escort were now slaughtered far from home. "They are everywhere," one Japanese officer complained after a disastrous mission. "The Lightning has made the Pacific small." The high-altitude performance of the P-38 was equally shocking. Turbo superchargers allowed it to soar above 30,000 feet, far higher than the Zero's effective ceiling. Japanese pilots who tried to climb to meet them often found their engines sputtering and controls sluggish. Meanwhile, the Lightnings dived from on high, unleashing fire with devastating precision. Survivors described the attacks as sudden and merciless. "They came out of the sun," one pilot wrote, "and before we could turn, before we could even see them clearly, our planes were falling." The long reach of the Lightning also gave American commanders new flexibility. They could use P-38s not only for air superiority, but for reconnaissance, ground attack, and even long-range strafing missions against Japanese shipping. The versatility of the plane meant that Japanese forces never felt safe. A transport convoy moving between islands might suddenly find itself under attack by fighters it thought were too far away to interfere. An airfield deep in Japanese territory might wake to find its planes shredded on the ground by lightnings that had flown all night to reach it. For Japanese pilots, the psychological strain grew unbearable. They had been trained to expect combat near the front lines, within sight of their bases. Now they found themselves fighting deep in what they had thought were secure zones. "There was no rear area," one pilot admitted after the war. "With the Lightning, the Americans could strike us anywhere." This reach also transformed American bomber operations. Heavy bombers like the B-24 Liberator and later the B-25 Mitchell required escort to survive against Japanese fighters. Before the Lightning, escorts simply could not keep up. Missions often ended in slaughter as unprotected bombers were torn apart by Zeros. With the P-38, however, bombers suddenly had guardians that could fly with them all the way to target and back again. The result was devastating for Japan's war effort. Factories, shipping routes, and bases that had once been secure now lay within the American strike zone. The numbers tell the story. Throughout 1943 and 1944, P-38 squadrons racked up kills not just by the dozens, but by the hundreds. In New Guinea alone, they destroyed Japanese formations so thoroughly that some units ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. Pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire became household names, each scoring over 30 victories in the Lightning. Behind every individual success lay the same truth. The P-38 could reach farther, fight longer, and return home when no other plane could. Japanese pilots tried to adapt. They shifted to night flying, hoping to evade the daytime hunters. They attempted to lure Lightnings into traps, drawing them low where the Zero's agility still counted. Occasionally, these tactics worked. But for every American plane lost, many more Japanese fighters were destroyed. And the sheer relentlessness of the Lightning's presence, its ability to reappear day after day in skies thought safe, eroded morale in ways that were impossible to measure. Commanders at Japanese airfields began to issue warnings to their men. Do not underestimate the twin-tailed fighter. Treat it with caution. Do not engage alone. Do not climb to meet it. These warnings were half advice, half admission of defeat. For a culture that prized the courage of individual duels and the skill of close dogfighting, the Lightning represented a nightmare. It was not only stronger and faster, it fought by different rules, rules the Japanese could not bend back in their favor. For American ground troops, the P-38's reach was a lifeline. Soldiers in New Guinea wrote home about the comfort of hearing its engines overhead. Marines in the Solomons cheered when Lightning swooped in to break up Japanese raids. To them, the twin-tailed silhouette meant safety, a shield against the relentless enemy. For the Japanese on the other side, it meant dread. It meant that no matter how far they flew, no matter how deep into their territory they patrolled, the Lightning could find them. By 1944, more than 1,000 Japanese pilots had felt the sting of the Lightning. Many never returned from missions where the P-38 appeared suddenly, struck hard, and disappeared into the clouds. Those who survived often admitted that the war in the air had changed forever. "We could no longer imagine victory," one officer said years later. "When the Lightning came, it made our world smaller. We were trapped in the sky." By the spring of 1943, the Japanese Empire was under mounting strain. Guadalcanal had been lost, New Guinea was slipping away, and the once mighty Imperial Navy no longer prowled the Pacific with impunity. But to many Japanese officers, one figure remained a symbol of resilience and strategy: Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Architect of Pearl Harbor, commander of the combined fleet, Yamamoto embodied both the daring and the destiny of Japan's war effort. His name carried weight among sailors, pilots, and generals alike. Protect Yamamoto, and morale could endure. Lose him, and the consequences would be unimaginable. What Yamamoto could not know was that his every move was being watched. Thanks to American codebreakers, Japanese naval messages were being read almost as soon as they were transmitted. In April 1943, one such message revealed that Yamamoto intended to make an inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The itinerary was exact: departure time, route, and even the aircraft he would be flying in. For U.S. commanders, the opportunity was extraordinary. Yamamoto's death would strike a psychological blow deeper than the loss of ships or bases. The mission was approved. Its code name was Operation Vengeance. The task fell to the P-38 Lightning. No other fighter had the range to intercept Yamamoto's aircraft over Bougainville and return safely. From Guadalcanal, the round trip would stretch more than 400 miles each way, across hostile waters, with no margin for error. The Lightnings would have to navigate with pinpoint accuracy, arriving at the exact place and time of Yamamoto's flight. If they were late, he would be gone. If they were early, they risked detection. Success demanded precision. 18 P-38s took off on the morning of April 18, 1943. Their mission was cloaked in secrecy. Only a handful of men knew the true target. The pilots flew low over the ocean, skimming just above the waves to avoid Japanese radar. Hours ticked by in tense silence, each man focused on his instruments, his fuel, his position in the formation. Then, at the appointed hour, they began to climb. Ahead, glinting in the sunlight, came the silhouettes of 2 Japanese bombers, escorted by several Zero fighters. Yamamoto was aboard one of the bombers, a Mitsubishi G4M Betty. The P-38 swooped in. The escorting Zeros tried to react, but the Americans had the advantage of altitude and surprise. Diving with speed, the Lightnings cut through the formation. Machine guns and cannons blazed. One bomber erupted in smoke and flame, spiraling into the jungle below. The second bomber, too, was set ablaze. Yamamoto's plane had been struck. It crashed deep in the jungle, killing the admiral instantly. For the Japanese, the shock was immense. Their greatest strategist, the man who had warned against war with America yet planned its most famous attack, was dead. News of his loss spread slowly at first. concealed by officials who feared the blow to morale. But within the Air Force and Navy, whispers circulated. Yamamoto had been killed by American fighters. And not just any fighters, but the twin-tailed demons that had already begun to haunt Japanese skies. To the pilots who had escorted him, the memory was searing. They described the P-38s as appearing suddenly, with terrifying speed, striking decisively, and vanishing before they could mount a defense. It was as if they knew exactly where we would be, one survivor said. We were not outflown. We were outthought. The Americans celebrated the mission as proof of both their intelligence capabilities and the power of the Lightning. Operation Vengeance became legendary. The P-38 had shown it could not only dominate in combat, but reach across vast distances to deliver a surgical strike that altered the course of the war. For Japanese commanders, Yamamoto's death was more than a personal loss. It was a sign that the empire's leaders were no longer safe, that even their most guarded figures could be hunted down in the skies they once ruled. In Tokyo, the announcement of Yamamoto's death stunned the military hierarchy. Some officers wept openly. Others sat in silence, staring at maps that now seemed emptier without the admiral's guidance. The loss of Yamamoto, one general admitted, was like the loss of an entire fleet. The psychological effect rippled outward. Pilots who had once believed their leaders untouchable now knew otherwise. The Americans had not only intercepted Yamamoto, they had done so with surgical precision, guided by intelligence, executed by a machine that seemed built for the task. The P-38 was no longer just another fighter. It had become a symbol of inevitability, of American power stretching far beyond what Japanese imagination had once allowed. Operation Vengeance was more than the death of an admiral. It was the death of certainty, the certainty that the empire could protect its leaders, the certainty that Japanese pilots could outfight their opponents, the certainty that the skies of the Pacific still belonged to them. On April 18, 1943, over the jungles of Bougainville, the Lightning struck, and more than 1,000 Japanese pilots would never forget the shock. By the middle of 1943, the Pacific skies no longer echoed only with the sound of Zeros hunting freely. Instead, the drone of American twin-engine fighters became a constant presence, the unmistakable hum of P-38 Lightnings, announcing that the balance of power was shifting. Guadalcanal and Operation Vengeance had been signs. What followed was transformation. The Japanese had once believed that their pilots' skill and spirit would outweigh any technological advantage the Americans might produce. For the first year of the war, that belief seemed justified. Zeros and Oscar fighters dominated against Wildcats and Warhawks. Yet now, with the Lightning, American pilots entered combat on new terms. They were not just surviving. They were winning. The Lightning became the workhorse of the Pacific Air War. In New Guinea, its range and power made it indispensable. Missions stretched over mountains, jungles, and seas, places where single-engine planes would have faltered. Lightnings flew long escort missions, shepherding B-24 Liberators to bomb Rabaul, Wewak, and Leh. They dove on Japanese airfields, guns tearing through rows of parked aircraft. They strafed convoys creeping along the coast, their cannons sinking barges and transport ships. Everywhere they appeared, the Japanese saw their grip slipping. For the pilots of the Rising Sun, it was the attrition that stunned them most. By late 1943, squadrons were no longer what they had been. The long and meticulous pre-war training program that had forged the elite flyers of Pearl Harbor and the early Pacific campaigns was gone. Losses over Guadalcanal and New Guinea had bled away hundreds of veterans. The replacements were boys, barely trained, thrust into cockpits with only a handful of hours flight time. Against wildcats, they might have stood a chance. Against lightnings, they were lambs led to slaughter. Reports describe combat that ended before the Japanese even knew what hit them. P-38s diving from high altitude, striking with cannon fire, then climbing away, leaving smoke and wreckage behind. Survivors landed shaken, telling their commanders of enemy fighters they could neither match nor escape. They appeared from nowhere, one pilot wrote, and when they left, half our formation was gone. The Americans exploited every advantage. Pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas McGuire honed tactics that multiplied the Lightning's strengths. They flew in pairs and fours, watching each other's tails, denying the Zeros the chance to slip behind them. They learned to climb where the enemy could not follow, to dive at speeds that tore Japanese wings from their frames. They fought not for the elegance of the duel, but for the certainty of the kill. Bong became America's top ace, with 40 confirmed victories, almost all in the Lightning. McGuire tallied 38 before his death in 1945. Charles McDonnell scored 36. Their names became legend, but behind them were hundreds of other Lightning pilots who chipped away at Japanese strength day after day, sortie after sortie. By 1944, the Japanese air forces were not just outnumbered. They were outflown, outfought, and outlasted. The statistics reveal the scale. Over New Guinea, Allied forces destroyed more than 2,000 Japanese aircraft in less than a year. Many of those kills belonged to P-38 squadrons. In the Solomons, Japanese airfields were pounded until they could no longer sustain operations. Supply convoys were sunk before they reached their destinations. What had once been a vast empire connected by sea lanes and air routes shrank under the relentless reach of the Lightning. For Japanese commanders, the effect was devastating. They issued new orders: avoid combat with P-38s unless in superior numbers, conserve pilots for the defense of the homeland. But these orders only highlighted their desperation. If we do not fight them, they will strike us. If we do fight them, we die, one officer lamented. The aura of confidence that had defined Japanese aviation in 1941 had evaporated. In its place was a grim resignation. Even the much-feared Zero began to lose its mystique. Once considered untouchable, it now fell in flames by the dozens. Its thin armor and lack of self-sealing tanks, once acceptable trade-offs for agility, became liabilities in prolonged combat. Japanese engineers tried to field newer fighters, the Ki-84 Hayate, the Ki-61 Hien, but none arrived in sufficient numbers, nor with the training pipeline needed to sustain them. The Lightning, by contrast, kept coming in squadron after squadron, its pilots growing more experienced with each mission. The shift was not only tactical, but psychological. For Japanese pilots, combat had once been a proving ground of skill and honor. Now it was survival against a machine they described as unstoppable. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence revealed despair. One pilot wrote home, "The twin-tailed fighter is a curse. It hunts us like wolves hunt sheep. Every mission we wonder if it will be our last." For American soldiers on the ground and sailors at sea, the change was visible too. Where once Japanese bombers had struck with impunity, now they were intercepted far from their targets. Convoys reached their destinations under lightning escort. The skies, once the domain of the rising sun, now glowed with American dominance. By 1944, it was undeniable. The tide had turned. The P-38 Lightning was no longer simply a new fighter. It was the spearhead of Allied air power in the Pacific. Its long reach, its heavy firepower, its resilience, and its pilots' growing mastery had broken the back of Japanese aviation. More than 1,000 Japanese pilots had been stunned, defeated, and in many cases killed by encounters with the Lightning. The Empire's hunters had become the hunted. The skies they once claimed as their own now belonged to the twin-tailed demon. And for Japanese commanders, the realization was brutal. The war in the air was lost. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered its final, most desperate stage. Japan's empire was crumbling, its fleet shattered at Leyte Gulf, its armies retreating across the islands, and its skies darkened by the endless waves of American aircraft. Yet even as the outcome became inevitable, Japanese pilots continued to take to the air. Many flew with a sense of duty, others with despair, and some with the fanaticism of men who believed that sacrifice itself might delay defeat. Against them rose the P-38 Lightning, still patrolling, still escorting, still hunting, a twin-tailed presence that had come to define American air dominance. In the Philippines, the Lightnings fought some of their fiercest battles. As American forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, Japanese squadrons scrambled to challenge them. Among the defenders were veterans of the early war, men who had flown at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, determined to make one last stand. They threw their Zeros and new fighters like the Ki-84 into the fray, hoping to overwhelm the Americans with numbers and courage. But the battles unfolded differently than they had in 1941 or 1942. The P-38s did not meet them in swirling dogfights. They met them with altitude, speed, and firepower. Lightning pilots dove from the sky, tore through formations, and climbed again. Japanese pilots tried to turn inside them to pull the familiar spirals that had once given them victory. But the Lightnings refused the duel. They slashed, they struck, they left wreckage behind. It was like fighting shadows, one Japanese survivor admitted. We could not touch them. They killed us and disappeared. By then, the imbalance was overwhelming. American production had filled the skies with Lightnings, Mustangs, and Hellcats, while Japanese squadrons dwindled. Shortages of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts grounded many planes before they could even take off. Pilots who did fly often did so with minimal training, facing opponents with years of experience. The result was slaughter. In a single week of fighting over Leyte, Japanese losses soared into the hundreds, while the Lightnings returned with only a handful of casualties. As the Americans advanced toward Iwo Jima in early 1945, the pattern repeated. Japanese pilots rose to meet the invaders, some in modern fighters, many in outdated Zeros. They flew with bravery that cannot be denied, diving into overwhelming odds. But bravery was no substitute for numbers and technology. Lightnings hunted them ruthlessly, clearing the skies for bombers and covering Marines as they stormed ashore. By Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the duels had taken on a tragic character. Many Japanese pilots were ordered to fly suicide missions, kamikaze attacks against American ships. Yet even these desperate flights often ended before they began, cut down by patrols of P-38s and other American fighters. The Lightning's long range allowed it to intercept kamikazes far from their targets, turning suicide runs into fiery deaths in the open sky. Survivors recalled the terror of facing the twin-tailed demons in their final moments. They destroyed us without hesitation, one kamikaze pilot wrote before his last mission. We had no chance, but still we flew. For the American pilots, the final duels were different too. They faced opponents who no longer fought to win, but to die. Some Lightnings fell to desperate ramming attacks, others to swarms of kamikazes, breaking through sheerly by numbers. But the vast majority of engagements ended with the Americans in control. Lightning pilots grew into veterans with dozens of kills, their confidence absolute. They respected their adversaries' courage, but they no longer feared them. By the summer of 1945, Japan's Air Force was a shadow of its former self. More than 20,000 planes had been lost in combat across the war. Many of those losses came at the hands of the P-38. Japanese aces who had once boasted of their kills now counted only survival as victory. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Zero was gone, burned away by years of attrition and by the relentless presence of the Lightning. In the last duels, the contrast was stark. On one side, young Japanese pilots, barely trained, flying obsolete planes into hopeless battles. On the other, seasoned American veterans in machines that had proven themselves time and again. The outcome was foregone. Yet still they fought. Still they climbed into cockpits and faced the twin tails across the Pacific sky. For more than 1,000 Japanese aviators, those duels ended in shock, defeat, and often death. When the surrender finally came in August 1945, many of the surviving Japanese pilots admitted privately that the Lightning had been the true symbol of their defeat. Not the bombers that dropped fire on their cities, not the carriers that brought fleets to their shores, but the twin-engined fighter that had stalked them relentlessly across the Pacific. The P-38 was the hunter, one veteran said years later. We were the hunted. And in the end, there was no escape. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific skies were no longer the hunting grounds of the Zero. They belonged to the twin-tailed demons that had haunted Japanese aviators for nearly 3 years. The P-38 Lightning had entered the war as an untested design, mocked by some for its ungainly shape, doubted even by its own pilots. But by the end, it had earned its reputation as one of the most decisive weapons of the conflict, and as the nightmare of more than 1,000 Japanese pilots who had faced it and been stunned by its power. For the Japanese, the memory of the Lightning was inseparable from the memory of defeat. Pilots who had once trained for graceful dogfights remembered instead the terror of sudden, high-speed, slashing attacks. They recalled the frustration of trying to climb to meet an enemy that simply soared away, or the helplessness of watching cannon shells tear through their fragile aircraft before they could even turn. Survivors admitted years later that the Lightning broke not only their formations, but their spirit. We were not defeated in battle alone, one former ace wrote. We were defeated in our hearts. The Lightning made us believe we could not win. For American crews, the P-38 became a symbol of pride. They had flown it across distances no fighter had ever traveled, escorted bombers deep into enemy territory, and fought battles that shifted the balance of the war. They endured long hours in cramped cockpits, fuel gauges trembling as they stretched every mile of range, engines straining in tropical heat. They lost friends in duels, in accidents, in missions that went wrong. But they also emerged as victors, their names etched into history as aces who proved that American technology and training could overcome the vaunted Japanese flyers. The Lightning's legacy extended beyond combat statistics. It was the plane that killed Yamamoto, striking at the heart of Japanese command. It was the plane that covered the invasions of the Philippines and New Guinea, that intercepted bombers, that destroyed convoys, that reduced the Japanese air arm to ashes. In the Pacific, no other fighter shaped the outcome so completely. By the war's end, P-38s had claimed thousands of enemy aircraft, and more importantly, they had stripped away the myth of Japanese superiority in the air. Japanese commanders admitted as much in their post-war reflections. Many spoke of the Lightning with a mixture of bitterness and respect. They described it as a machine that could not be beaten on equal terms, one that changed the rules of aerial combat. It was not a fighter as we understood fighters, one officer confessed. It was a weapon of another kind. It did not duel. It hunted. In villages and cities across Japan, the memories of the Lightning lived on in quieter ways. Children who had once watched the twin tails gleam above their homes recalled the fear of air raid sirens and the sight of falling planes. Families who had lost sons in the air remembered the letters that spoke of fork-tailed devils and demons in the clouds. For them, the Lightning was not a symbol of technology, but of loss. And yet, even amid the devastation, some Japanese pilots came to respect the machine that had beaten them. In later years, when former enemies met at commemorations and air shows, they spoke with admiration of the P-38's power and design. Some even admitted that flying against it had been an honor, a test against one of the greatest fighters of the war. The Lightning's story did not end in 1945. It served in reconnaissance roles into the 1950s, its long range making it valuable even in the new jet age. Its silhouette, once so strange, became iconic, the twin tails instantly recognizable in photographs and films. In museums, preserved Lightnings gleam under hangar lights, their polished skins reflecting the memory of the battles they fought. Veterans who walk past them pause, remembering friends, missions, victories, and losses. For historians, the P-38 remains a case study in innovation. It proved that unconventional design could succeed, that endurance and firepower could redefine air combat. It demonstrated that wars are not won only by bravery or spirit, but by the marriage of engineering, industry, and strategy. And it showed that in the vast Pacific, where distance defined every battle, range could be the most decisive weapon of all. For the Japanese, the Lightning remains a ghost, a reminder of the days when they ruled the skies and of the moment when that rule ended. For over 1,000 pilots, the encounter with the twin-tailed demon was their last. For the survivors, it was a memory that lingered for decades, a symbol of the war they fought and the war they lost. The story of the P-38 Lightning is not just about a plane. It is about the end of an era. It is about the shattering of illusions, the collision of old tactics with new technology, the moment when the masters of the sky were humbled by a machine they could not understand. It is about the stunned silence of Japanese commanders who once believed in their invincibility, only to watch it torn away by twin engines and a flash of silver across the sun. The Lightning came to the Pacific as an experiment. It left as a legend. And for those who faced it, who looked up at its twin tails and felt the shock of its guns, it would forever be remembered as the demon that ruled the sky. In the years after the war, when the guns were silent and the empire was gone, Japanese pilots began to speak about what they had seen and felt in the skies. Some wrote memoirs, others gave interviews, many spoke only in private conversations, recorded decades later. What emerged from these voices was not just the story of combat, but the story of shock, the stunned realization of men who had believed themselves invincible, only to be humbled by the twin-tailed Lightning. Veterans who had flown the Zero in the glory days of 1941 remembered the first time they faced a P-38. One described it as like seeing a new animal on the battlefield, something we did not know how to fight. The twin engines, the speed, the way it refused to turn with them. It was unlike any enemy they had trained for. We were hunters, he admitted, but when the Lightning came, we became the hunted. Others spoke of the psychological weight the Lightning carried. Pilots recounted how their confidence drained when they saw the silhouette of twin tails glinting against the sun. You could see it from far away, one recalled. And when you saw it, you felt dread. We knew what was coming. Some even confessed that they considered turning back before combat began, fearing the odds against the American fighter. There were accounts of resilience, too. A Japanese officer remembered firing a full burst into a Lightning, watching pieces fly from its wing, only to see it keep climbing, one engine smoking, still fighting. Our Zero would have fallen in flames. The Lightning flew home. How do you fight such a machine? The respect grew alongside the fear. Many pilots, in later years, admitted admiration for the Americans who flew the P-38. They spoke of its versatility, escort, reconnaissance, strafing, interception, and marveled at how a single type could dominate so many roles. One former ace put it simply, it was not just a fighter, it was an army in the sky. The death of Admiral Yamamoto came up often in post-war reflections. Pilots who had served in the Solomons remembered the day their leader was struck down by lightnings. We did not believe it at first, one said. We thought it must be propaganda. But when we knew it was true, we felt despair. If even Yamamoto could be killed from the sky, then who could be safe? The mission became a symbol of inevitability, the moment many realized the war would not end in Japan's favor. Young pilots who had entered the war in 1944 or 1945 recalled the Lightning as a terror they faced almost daily. Their training had been rushed, their planes often outdated. Against the P-38, they had no chance. I remember climbing into my Zero knowing I would probably not return, one survivor said decades later. The Lightning was waiting for us. We knew it. For many, their only memories of the war were of watching comrades fall in flames, cut down by an enemy they never had the skill or machines to match. Even commanders spoke candidly after the war. Some admitted they had underestimated the impact of the P-38, focusing instead on the larger bombers or the carriers. But in hindsight, they realized the Lightning had been the true turning point. It destroyed our confidence, one officer reflected. We could not defend our convoys, our bombers, even our leaders. The Lightning was always there. For the families of pilots lost, the Lightning became a ghost. Mothers and fathers received letters describing battles against the fork-tailed devil, only to hear weeks later that their sons had not returned. Wives remembered their husbands whispering the name of the American fighter with both fear and respect. The memory lingered long after the surrender. And yet, alongside bitterness, there was also admiration. In post-war meetings between former enemies, Japanese pilots sometimes shook hands with American Lightning veterans. They spoke of the duels, of the differences in tactics, of the moments when luck and skill decided who lived and who died. Some even climbed into restored P-38s at air shows, running their hands along the fuselage, shaking their heads at the power of the machine that had once haunted them. In the collective memory of Japan's aviators, the Lightning held a special place. It was not the most numerous American fighter. That honor belonged to the Hellcat and the Mustang. But it was the one that struck them hardest, that shattered their confidence when they still believed in victory. It was the fighter that killed their admiral, that escorted the bombers that burned their cities, that stalked them across the endless Pacific, until there was nowhere left to hide. One Japanese pilot summed it up best in his memoir. We feared the bombers. We feared the carriers. But the plane that broke our spirit was the Lightning. It was the demon of the Pacific, and we could not exorcise it. For historians, these voices of the vanquished reveal the deeper truth of the war. Battles are not won only in numbers or machines, but in the minds of those who fight. The P-38 Lightning stunned more than 1,000 Japanese pilots not only because it outperformed them, but because it erased their belief in dominance. It changed the psychology of the air war, turning proud hunters into desperate defenders. In the end, the Lightning's greatest victory was not just in the planes it destroyed, but in the hearts it stunned. For the men who faced it, who looked up and saw twin tails cutting across the sky, the memory never faded. The Lightning became the symbol of their defeat, the demon that ruled the Pacific sky, and the shadow that followed them for the rest of their lives.